Can good design shape a better world? At Monocle's Quality of Life conference in Barcelona this September, we'll be putting that question to the people who already are. Join leading designers, architects, and creative leaders as we explore how design intersects with culture, business, and everyday life. Plus, great food, excellent company, and plenty of Catalan charm. Find out more and book your seat at monocle.com/conference.
This is Monocle on Design, a show where we discuss everything from architecture and craft to furniture and graphic design. I'm Nick Bernice. Today's program is a dedicated special on timber. As part of this, we'll visit the South London studio of wood artist Darren Appiagyei. We'll also head to Portland, Oregon to find out why it's a mass timber hub. Plus, design and research organisation Material Cultures share why pine needles are overlooked as a resource. All that coming up on Monocle on Design. Hello and welcome to today's program. It's a timber special. Aside from being the name of one of my favourite songs by Pitbull and Kesha, the material also forms the framework for outstanding architecture and design work across the globe. Evidence suggests that wood has been used for construction for over 10,000 years, with early examples including Stone Age shelters and Neolithic longhouses. It's also a primary material for furniture makers and artists. Case in point is Darren Appiagyei. While still a student, the South London creative discovered the wood lathe, a rotating machine tool that allows timber to be sanded, drilled, cut and turned with exceptional symmetry. But since graduation, his practice has developed to create more organic forms. This year, the maker won the Collect Open, a prestigious UK-based award that celebrates the best in contemporary craft. His prize-winning collection is called What Grows in the Dark Comes to Light, and it includes 10 vessels that explore scale, cluster formation and texture. To find out more about Darren's practice and his personal journey too, this show's producer, Maylee Evans, went along to his studio.
I'll say sustainability is key to my practice. I only use woods that have naturally fallen. So the majority of the timber that I source is actually from a farm based just out of South London in Welling. I literally rummage through. It's kind of like a treasure hunt for me. Whatever catches my attention, I look at it, I look at the details. It could be the grain, it could be the texture. It could even be simply the cracks. This piece of wood here has actually got a beautiful bark just literally on top of the timber, and that's what's caught my attention. You can actually see a bit of life in the timber. You can see a bit of greenery. It's coming off. I think it's grass I love that aspect. I love playing around with that. I know I won't be able to keep all of that, but I'll be able to keep aspects of that when I work with the material. As it's spinning, you've got the tool rest, and then I rest like a chisel or a gouge, and I carve into the wood as it's spinning. It can be dangerous, but the main thing is I start off very slowly, carve very slowly, and that's how I'm able to see the different tones and textures as I, we call it turning, as I turn. It's very therapeutic. How can I keep that natural essence of the material when I work with it and I make vessels out of it? How can I show aspects of its living material when I work with the vessel and it's completed? I like to play on the fact that you don't actually know what my pieces are until you look closely into it and you pick it up and you touch it. And that's part of the experience. It's a sensory experience. It's not just visually seeing it, but it's actually touching it and understanding the components and also realizing, oh, this is actually wood, because you can see the grain. I use this tool here. It's called an Arbitec. This piece here is made out of horse chestnut wood. I actually had a friend who was getting rid of some timber. So she had two tree surgeons who actually came to her home and they had to cut down the tree. I actually hadn't worked with horse chestnut before. I had heard it had a beautiful texture and tone. However, it's not the most tactile piece of wood to work with, and it crumbles quite easily, but it's got beautiful grain. I was sold. But that's the whole point of working with a variety of different timbers. You don't know what to expect. Different textures. I see it as a challenge. I see it as an exploration, just playing around. I work whenever I'm in my studio, on my lathe. I just explore. I try and not think about my constraints, and I just focus on the material. Understanding its characteristics, how malleable is the material, what's the textures like, what type of grain does it have, is there a transition in the tones in the wood? So these are all the aspects that I'm looking at when I work with timber, ash to oak, beech.
You worked once with banksia nut and you were quite keen to move away from that. It was something that you'd stumbled upon in the shop and was interested in, but you kind of didn't want to continue down that path.
I did get a lot of attention working with the banksia nut, as just alone as a material is just interesting to look at. And I managed to make a name for myself through working with the material. However, the issue was that I could only source it from Australia. It didn't sit right with me. If I'm trying to have a sustainable practice and I'm trying to put that in the forefront of my practice, I had to make the decision, even though this is kind of gaining me a lot of acclaim and success, to say I need to pivot and go in a different direction. I've had many people say, because I still have a couple of pieces, as you can see just over there. But people are like, oh wow, that always catches people's attention. I just have to say that's my previous album.
You recently won Collect Open. 10 artists are selected and given the opportunity to create their installation. You won with a project that was about your late mother. Very personal narrative to bring into your output and your work. How important is it for you to bring in your own life and your own story?
I think it's important to tell elements of your life in your work. And I feel like sometimes the story can be sometimes even stronger than the actual piece itself. And that's what enables you to have legacy. I think it's finding that balance, because also this is very personal to me. So I don't want to say I'm capitalizing on what's happened to me, but it influences my work. And even though the story is quite tragic, I see it as an opportunity to honour my mum and also to educate people on what fibroids is. So my mum passed away from it. Fibroids is a non-cancerous growth that develops in the womb. And so for Collect Open, I created 10 vessels called growth. So each growth vessel is growing in scale, and so I'm exploring textures and clusters. If you Google fibroids, it doesn't look like fibroids, but it's more so an interpretation. Also just seeing the effects that it had on my mum. And so the shapes are very much organic. But I think now I'm at a space where it makes sense in my life, where I'm able to talk about and also incorporate my personal life into my work. I use a machine called a pyrography machine. It's like essentially a pen. You plug it in and I literally burn the wood dot by dot. It's like a soldering iron. Imagine it's like a pen, pointillism, and I'm literally burning the wood dot by dot. Again, with that playful mentality, I developed the technique, but I just really found it quite therapeutic. And I loved the different tones and the textures that I got from it. It's quite labor intensive. So sometimes I will be burning for a couple of hours and I'll be like, it's enough. Come back with a new item the next day and continue to burn. The main reason why I started to burn is I realized that you could see the transition of tone in some of the pieces. It also has become like a signature of my work. Traditional wood turning is more about a beautiful shape, highly polished. I think I found a method that kind of signifies my work and also helps with my concepts as well. So it's a great balance. And it's still something I'm exploring and figuring out. Like on a bigger scale, how does that look? It's great when it's small, but just behind you, I've got my biggest piece, which I've just burnt. Burning that dot by dot's a lot of work. And also visually seeing how it works is a completely different, seeing it on a smaller scale. I feel like I'm still at the beginning of understanding what my work looks like visually.
Darren Appiagyei there, in conversation with Maylee Evans. As mentioned at the top of the show, humans have been building with wood for millennia. But it was only 30-odd years ago that enterprising builders in Central Europe invented what is now known as mass timber. This material is an engineered wood product that's stronger than traditional cut lumber. Its value has soared in recent years thanks to its biophilic properties and growing sustainability credentials. It means that mass timber is catching on not just in Europe, but across the Atlantic as well. Monocle's Seattle correspondent Gregory Scruggs ventured down to Portland, Oregon, North America's emerging hub for mass timber, to have a look.
10 years ago, the International Building Code adopted the use of mass timber for the first time. It was a watershed moment for North American architects disposed to working with wood to build something at a larger scale than the typical single-family house. Among those ready to lead the charge was Thomas Robinson, who picked up mass timber know-how from his early career stint at Herzog and de Meuron. In 2009, Robinson left Switzerland and co-founded Lever Architecture in Portland, a city he felt was perfectly positioned to embrace mass timber's potential. Today, his firm has left its mark on Oregon with a portfolio that deploys mass timber in everything from corporate campuses to museums and university buildings. I started my exploration into the North American rise of mass timber by asking Robinson why Oregon is so well suited to this building material.
It comes down to the weather and the soils and the geography, but I've been told by foresters that in particular the coastal southern Oregon is the best place in the world to grow Douglas fir in its native habitat. And I think that directly connects to the fact that we can grow this timber, which is the strongest structural softwood. Some people also think it's one of the most beautiful, in a place that's connected to the geography and the weather, the landscape, and the culture of this place.
Why, indeed, have you chosen mass timber so often in your work? What makes it a preferred building material? In what settings do you find it to be the most appropriate?
Almost all buildings in Oregon are built out of timber. This isn't like a necessarily new material for us, and we've pushed the limits of building with timber with what we call balloon frame or stick frame, and we do buildings that are 75 feet high and quite large with timber. And that's something that we've been involved with at least ever since I started my own practice, because I was previously working on museums and those types of buildings. So the kind of choice to build with wood is really connected to the kind of culture of building that we have here already in the Northwest. But I think for us it was really, how can we in a way leverage, how can we sort of add value to this amazing product in a way that people can actually sort of experience. Many of us grew up in timber houses. We just didn't know they were timber.
Unpack that thought that we all grew up in timber homes, we just didn't realize it. Is that to say stick frame was covered with drywall or cladding, some kind of brick facade that masked what was actually the structure of the home?
People don't think that there is a modular way of building in the United States. The reality is stick framing and balloon framing is probably one of the most successful modular building system, ever invented, at least in the West. And since 1842, when it was patented by a carpenter in Chicago, our entire supply chain, our entire sort of forest ecosystem is built around supplying the 2x4s, 2x6s, and 2x12s that are used to build our houses. And I think it's so kind of prevalent that we don't even see it anymore. And I think it's important maybe that we do see it in these, in new buildings. And I think mass timber has the opportunity to connect us back to the forest and to the health of the forests, because it's one of North America's most maybe undervalued assets.
Where would you gauge the actual state of play for the role of mass timber in at least North American building and architecture? Can you give a temperature check on the actual practical applications and where are the limits being stretched? Are we indeed going to be seeing wooden skyscrapers, or is that a bit exaggerated?
10 years ago, there were almost no buildings made out of mass timber in the United States. Now we're closing in on 1,500, and there's probably another 1,000 in the pipeline. So you're seeing this incredible growth and interest in it. You're seeing timber or timber hybrid buildings that are quite tall being built, and there's many, many more in the pipeline. So I think what you're seeing here is it's moving beyond sort of the one-off, the first in each specific geography or each specific building type to something that's more of a mass movement. And so I don't think that's going away. I think it will accelerate. I think the big kind of challenge is not necessarily the technical aspect of building with mass timber. I think we were able to do that now in the U.S. It's evolved. We've really tried to kind of build up the core competencies that are needed to do that. I think what the biggest challenge is really sort of where the timber sourced from, what is the impact of the sourcing on people's perceptions of, the sustainability of these buildings, but also how that's impacting communities, that are forest adjacent.
There's no better place to understand where local timber is sourced from than at Sustainable Northwest Wood, a Portland lumber yard that meticulously sources high-quality wood from small landowners around the region. I stopped into the showroom where hundreds of samples were on display and asked sales representative Lynn Morgan to show me a few highlights.
This is myrtle wood, which is a coastal wood that's native to Oregon, and it is a beautiful buttery yellow, golden hues with a little gray and some beautiful streaks of chocolate that come through because of the minerals in the soil. Myrtle wood is only native to Oregon, and it really kind of speaks to our landscape out here. And this is also sourced tribally, and so we're able to support some Northwest tribal enterprises and a couple sawmills that will cut this into lumber, and then another manufacturer, Xenoforest, that makes it into flooring for us.
What kinds of contractors, builders, architects have come through the showroom and selected this flooring material? Where might we find it underfoot in the near future?
You'll find it most prominently underfoot in the Portland airport. It was just recently done in Oregon white oak. It's a really good way to utilize wood that would otherwise usually get tossed into the kiln, to be burned. And so one of the things that the airport did was they wanted Oregon white oak flooring, but the wide plank flooring to cover 75,000 square feet was going to take a tremendous amount of wood and trees. And so one of the thought processes was to be able to use these smaller pieces of wood to make a floor tile, and it helps to utilize some of those offcuts that would normally just be thrown away. It uses more of the log itself and helps us to reduce waste overall.
This sounds like a real market opportunity that Sustainable Northwest Wood has found these maybe overlooked sources of timber and creative ways to apply them. Is that fair to say that's your je ne sais quoi, your secret sauce?
Yeah, that's really how we started the business, was through some restoration efforts and trying to find some useful ways to utilize the material that was coming out of restoration efforts. And so anything that's underutilized that doesn't have a home for, we try to create markets for it and try to build awareness about, the species that we have, what the forest has to offer, as opposed to trying to, fit forest products into the niche of, what an architect might want. We try to help people understand, what we have readily available.
In the North American context, the design case for mass timber often dovetails with other concerns. Yes, engineered wood can be beautiful, but it can also meet environmental goals and strengthen rural economies. What's more, there's an economic case around cost savings, something I learned about on my final stop at the annual International Mass Timber Conference. Among the thousands of attendees who come to Portland from around the world to show off the latest innovations, I tracked down Bill Parsons, Chief Operating Officer of Woodworks, an organization providing technical expertise that had conference-goers stopping in their tracks to watch a team of workers erect a mass timber structure right there in the middle of the convention center.
This is a two-story mock-up of a mass timber building that we use at training centers all over the country to train laborers on how to build with mass timber. Provides all of the different types of connections and gives them hands-on experience of building with mass timber. How do you make it slide together as efficiently as this beam that's going together right now, where the beam is just sliding directly into place? Because everything's pre-manufactured, everything is so precisely done that how do you fit it together is a lot of tips and tricks and little hands-on things really help. So this on a smaller scale than a large job site gives them that experience. And so we're basically building this structure and taking it down and building it again and doing that for the next 2 days. We have just a few people just essentially assembling, kind of taking those Legos off the truck and putting the building up. So you have less people assembling it faster for a shorter period of time, and that construction savings really makes a difference.
For Monocle, in Portland, Oregon, I'm Gregory Scruggs.
Finally on today's show, what can a woodland provide beyond standard lumber? And how else might this landscape provide materials that challenge our understanding of resources? To find the answers to these questions, we meet the team from Material Cultures. The UK-based design and research organisation was invited by London's Victoria and Albert Museum to investigate materials that come from woodlands that aren't explicitly timber. Summer Islam, co-director at Material Cultures, joined Maylee Evans in the studio to share some of the team's findings.
I guess we spend a lot of time as architects thinking about how you can use timber in buildings and timber framing and structural timbers and just trees as a source of timber. But a lot of our research has looked at, over the last few years, all the other things that come from woodlands and I guess the cultural place that woodlands have had in society and the role that woodlands used to have particularly in places where woodlands used to be common land, where you used to be able to go foraging and collect firewood, but also berries and trap animals and all these different things. So like thinking about woodlands as a kind of an abundance and a resource for people and not just as a kind of standing timber stock and woodshed, basically.
And why do you think that the standing timber stock idea has dominated the discussion? Why have we, at least in the UK, moved away from, I suppose, that wider understanding of the role of the woodland?
I think when you're growing up listening to sort of bedtime stories and folk tales about woodlands, it always paints a different picture of a kind of deep and wild and scary wood, which is kind of full of all sorts of things. But I think the kind of contemporary conception of forests comes from the woodlands that you see around us. If you drive into a woodland in the UK, particularly a public woodland, all the trees are in rows and they're often exactly the same species of exactly the same age. So that's called like an even-aged stand, basically. And that way of growing trees has developed in the UK after the Second World War, before and during which almost all the woodlands we had were cut down. Many of our woodlands in the UK are new. They're young and they were planted deliberately and in a controlled way in the kind of age of industrialisation and efficiency, thinking about how can we grow as much wood as we need really quickly and in a really easy way to count. That kind of system has actually meant that all of our woods today look a certain way and really are designed for timber production. That's what they're for now.
The installation Woodland Goods, which is on at London's Victoria and Albert Museum, was that more about getting the public to question their own biases and how they think about these places?
I guess the central premise of Woodland Goods, our project, was to think about our cultural relationship to timber and our cultural relationship to trees and the things that trees have around timber. So like we were looking specifically at bark, but there are lots of other resources you get from woodlands. Although the project manifested through a series of objects, like design objects and materials that we produced, the point of the work is to ask why we ask so little of our woodlands, why we demand so little of our public resources, and why it's become acceptable for what used to be a common ownership resource and something we all had a shared interest in to be managed in a way that none of us have a stake in and none of us have a say in, and actually very few of us have access to. Kind of for more context around a cultural question around woodlands, and it relates also for us in our minds to land ownership and principles of ownership in the UK. But the main thing is most of the woodlands we have in the UK are privately owned. They don't belong to us. They're owned by a few landowners, and what's grown in them and how those woods are managed is not up to most of the people who live in the UK.
And you mentioned there parts of the tree that you're looking at, so bark, but I understand you were also looking at natural glues and pine needles. Tell me what you were experimenting with and what you were exploring with those elements.
Yeah, so we began looking at kind of the skin of the tree, because it's the part of the tree that when it's processed isn't generally given much value and isn't regarded. But if you look back into kind of the history of materials coming from woodlands, a lot of cultures across the globe have used bark to make things. Like you can make textiles with it, you can weave with it, you can make baskets, you can make buildings. And then also in different ways, the sap that rises in the tree's skin can be used to make glues, or you can drink it, or you can turn it into stuff. And all that knowledge, which used to be also indigenous to the UK, has been lost. And so we were looking at what's in the skin, and when you peel it back, what can you use it for? And that came from an interest that we have in like glues and chemicals and materials, and thinking about how you can reduce the amount of, I guess, toxic substances that end up in our waterways. One of the issues that we find as designers working with timber or with wood or timber-based products in construction and in design is that they often come with glues and chemical coatings. So glues that stick things together, chemicals that treat them for fire or for insect attack. But all these things do end up in our rivers and in our soils. But traditional, or let's say more like indigenous knowledge around glues centered around that kind of skin of the tree, or like other things like animal-based products. And so we were looking at how can we make products we can use in design, timber-based materials that are glued together by natural stuff that will biodegrade and not harm rivers and soils.
And what were some of those outcomes, or what were your findings from those investigations?
So we made a few different sheet materials. We ended up in the world of flat things and things you can press and squash, because we found that lots of different tree species have in their bark kind of natural lignins or rosins and adhesive materials. And so we worked with our project partners Earthly and then Evolving Forests, who helped us picking the trees we were going to work with, to heat press barks together. With birch bark, we made a kind of plywood, which is really beautiful. It's one of my favourites, because you just peel the birch tree, so you get the bark, which is really thin and really silvery and beautiful. And then you layer it up together in a heat press and squash it and make it hot. And it melts the lignin, which is already present in the bark, and glues it back together and makes this kind of amazing plywood, which then had all the, I guess, the kind of crinkles in the tree, and also like where the lichens had been, and all the creases pressed into it, made a very beautiful thing. And we made a few different materials like that. One was pine bark, which was chipped and then bound together with natural resins and rosin, actually. And then the last one was sequoia bark, which was quite exciting. Coastal redwoods, which are a tree that we don't generally think of as being a kind of British woodland tree, but it's actually being grown more and more in the UK, particularly in the southwest, because as our climate is warming, it's becoming more like that of North America. So we were using different trees for their different kind of prevalences today in the landscape, thinking about ones that are really common, like pine, but also things like redwood, which we might have more of in the future as the climate changes.
And what were some of the outcomes from those investigations?
As architects, and I think quite as an organisation that's like quite practically minded, like always looking for how we can use stuff ourselves, we were thinking about maybe problems that we find on building sites or materials that we wish there were alternatives for. Plywood and OSB, so Oriented Strand Board, I think it's an acronym, are two like wood-based sheet materials that we use in building all the time that are bound with chemicals we wish weren't in our buildings. So we made alternatives for plywood and OSB, and you could imagine using them in a construction project in loads of ways, like sheathing a kind of timber frame, so like bracing it structurally. But also plywood is very beautiful for linings, and you could make furniture with plywood. You could panel a room like the one we're sitting in with plywood. I guess for us there are kind of structural applications, but there are also like loads of interior design applications or like joinery applications. And then we also made like external cladding with the sequoia bark, which is this really hairy and beautiful shaggy thing, which you could use as like a rain screen cladding on buildings. So that wouldn't be your like final defense against moisture, but a rain screen cladding in design and construction would be the kind of outermost skin of a building, which sheds most of the water off. So we found different ways that we thought those things could be used, but the project is a provocation. And it's a provocation because you can't make those materials at scale today, because the way we mill timber always chips the bark of a tree. It's not peeled carefully. It's not valued as something in and of itself. It's generally chipped very quickly by a big machine and composted and used for gardening or turned into something else. The question we were asking was, if we were to value the whole tree, roots to treetop, what other things might we be able to use our woodlands for? And to ask questions which I think for us are a bit uncomfortable. Like, we try not to practice it in an extractive way, but we are talking about extracting from woodlands and from the carbon cycle. But if you're going to do that, if you're going to do that very devastating thing and cut a tree down and use it, we should use all of it, or we should be conscious of the things we're not using and understand where those bits go. And we've sort of reformed the way we think about what we eat, but we don't think the same, I think, culturally and like broadly about the materials we use in design and where they come from.
Summer Islam there. The display, Woodland Goods, is on show at London's Victoria and Albert Museum in South Kensington until the 31st of October 2025. And that's all for today's show. For more design stories, listen to our 5-minute midweek bonus show, Monocle on Design Extra, which airs on Thursdays. And if you enjoy print, then do pick up a copy of Monocle magazine as well. It's on all good newsstands now. Today's episode was produced and edited by Maylee Evans. I'm Nick Manise, and you can reach me on nm@monocle.com. Thanks for listening.